Welcome to everyone for joining us in understanding the governor's executive orders on protecting reproductive freedom in healthcare in Arizona. So let's frame the discussion. What I want to do is give you all a bit of a primer on abortion access in Arizona prior to Dobbs and after Dobbs, and how we feel that the best way forward to advocate for abortion access is through reproductive justice. And I want to remind you why elections matter. And before I do that, I just want to give you just a brief overview of Desert Star Institute for Family Planning. We have been operating for 6 years now, and our priority and our mission is to create equitable access to reproductive health care for womb-bearing people while centering Black and Indigenous people of color. We envision a world where people have access to the full range of just, dignified, and exceptional health care, regardless of their circumstance or zip code, and that it is provided by compassionate providers who also advocate for reproductive health and justice in their communities. And learn more about our organization and our priorities and programs by visiting desertstarfp.org. Going to go ahead and drop that in the chat. Okay, good, thank you. And so let's get to this. So when I decided to become an abortion provider, I had no idea that I would end up operating an independent abortion clinic in a state that has nearly 40 abortion restrictions on the books. And prior to Dobbs, abortion access was already very restricted in Arizona. And so I'm going to run through a few of the restrictions that we have on the books for you. A pregnant person must receive state-directed counseling that includes information designed to discourage them from having an abortion, and then wait 24 hours before the abortion is provided. The counseling must be provided in person and must take place before the waiting period begins, thereby necessitating 2 trips to the facility. A pregnant person must undergo an ultrasound at least 24 hours before obtaining an abortion, and the provider must offer options to view the image. Abortion is covered in insurance policies for public employees and access only in cases which the pregnant person's life is endangered or lethal fetal abnormality. Now, this is pre-Dobbs. The use of telemedicine to administer medication abortion is prohibited. The parent of a minor must provide notarized consent before an abortion is provided. Abortion clinics must have protocols for resuscitation of a fetus, quote unquote, born alive during an abortion. Health plans offered in the state's health exchange under the Affordable Care Act can only cover abortion if the pregnant person's life is endangered or a lethal fetal abnormality. Advanced practice clinicians, like nurse practitioners, physician assistants, cannot perform surgical abortions or administer mifepristone for medical abortion. So this makes Arizona a physician-only state for abortion care. The physician performing an abortion must have admitting privileges at a hospital within a 30-mile radius of the location of the location where an abortion is being performed, or an agreement with the physician that has those privileges. So what did Dobbs do? Quite honestly, the only thing that Dobbs did was reduce the gestational weeks that someone is able to obtain an abortion in Arizona. So previously, we operated under a term called viability, which honestly is a legal construct created by the Supreme Court in 1973 with their Roe v. Wade decision, and it was co-opted by the medical community to now appear to be a normal part of medicine. Viability in a scientific term is each individual pregnancy has its own ability to determine whether, if a spontaneous delivery occurred, whether the child born would have a chance of survival and what that likelihood would be like. So these arbitrary viability standards are arbitrary. And it creates a compelling state interest in being able to control people's lives when they're pregnant. So the 15-week ban that we're operating under is the law in Arizona now that we're working with. And Victoria will share a little bit more about litigation that's happening around this. There was an 1864 pre-statehood ban on abortion that's also on the books. So we are providing abortion under this 15-week ban due to a court order while litigation continues on both counts. And so as we are seeing across the country now, people are not getting abortions for exceptions. We're hearing a lot of tragic stories across the country happening. We have women in Texas suing Texas about how their lives and their future fertility and their health were put in jeopardy because of these laws. So beyond 15 weeks, someone would need to be near death to have an abortion. Now, the other thing that happened with Dobbs is that after the Dobbs decision, our state appealed to the Supreme Court to be able to ban abortions for fetal genetic abnormalities, and they were granted the ability to do that. So a person in Arizona, regardless of how many weeks pregnant they are, cannot have an abortion in this state for any abnormality of the fetus. And so elections matter. Victoria is going to discuss more about the governor's executive orders, but we would be in a very different place right now in Arizona in terms of our ability to access abortion care if Governor Hobbs did not win election in November, and if Attorney General Chris Mays did not win election in November. Both of them barely won their elections. The work that Attorney General Mays is doing right now in fighting for us, all of this, everything you're hearing in the news around Mifepristone and Texas judge and Circuit 5s don't apply to Arizonans because of the work of Attorney General Chris Mays in the background, joining another federal lawsuit that protects Arizonans' ability to access Mifepristone for medication abortion in our state. So we could probably do another session on Attorney General Mays, so you guys can know all the great work that she and her staff have been doing to maintain access to the best of their abilities for Arizonans. And just yesterday, out of her office came some data around privacy, around accessing reproductive health care. And so we can drop that link in the chat so you can have access to that. That just came out of the Attorney General's office. Again, I'm just so proud to have voted for Chris Mays and her being elected. The other important piece of this, though, is that the governor and the Attorney General need our help. a lot of the work that they're doing are stopgaps. What's really going to return and then expand access to abortion care in Arizona is to flip the legislature. And for the past 3 elections, there has been a very slim majority of extremist legislators continuing to pass harmful legislation. For the last 3 elections, we've not been able to turn this around. And so, again, we have stopgaps, but the answer is to flip the legislature so we can repeal bad laws and put in better laws to advance our access to reproductive health care. And before I pass it on to Victoria, I want to say that we do not live in a country where every child born is wanted and well cared for. And therefore, people are making decisions to have abortions within the context of their whole lives, not in a vacuum. And so we need to stop talking about abortion as a separate issue. And we need to start creating policies that account for people's whole lives. And reproductive justice shows us how to do that. And our Deputy Director, Michelle Ponce, did an excellent presentation on reproductive justice in June, and you can find that on our YouTube channel. And we'll drop that link for you.
I'm Victoria Lopez, and I'm at the ACLU of Arizona. And a lot of our work over many years has been around litigation and policy advocacy, lobbying to defend against harmful laws that ban, criminalize, or otherwise impede access to abortion. The ACLU of Arizona is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization in Arizona, and we have members throughout the state. And our work focuses on defending and advancing the civil rights and civil liberties of Arizonans. So today I'll give an overview of 2 orders that were recently announced by the Hobbs administration that expand access to contraception, and another that narrows the avenues for criminal prosecution in abortion-related cases. So first, a note about executive orders in general. Sorry, Michelle, you can go back. The executive orders are nothing new. Executive orders have been a toolbox for governors for many years, and Arizona governors have issued executive orders over and over to address and implement policy, which is within the purview of the governor's office. For example, Governor Ducey issued approximately 120 executive orders as governor. Governor Jan Brewer issued about 60 during her time as governor. And as we've seen with across the country after Dobbs, governors across the country in Colorado, Maine, California, perhaps others, have been issuing executive orders to protect abortion in their states. Of course, we have seen disagreement with Governor Hobbs' executive orders, with some county attorneys and some legislatures saying that they will sue or somehow challenge the executive orders, although they haven't taken that action yet. So what we do know is that it's clear that the Governor Hobbs, or the governor of Arizona, has the authority to issue executive orders. So then questions about how to challenge the executive order typically arise on whether the order conflicts with some other law or the roles and responsibilities of various government actors. There's some favorable case law that addresses a governor's authority and in the area of criminal law, but of course not on this specific set of facts that we find ourselves in Arizona in this moment in time. So it sort of remains to be seen what will happen in terms of any kind of challenge to the current executive order. And as I was thinking about executive orders and trying to think of an example, again, because we're in this moment, there isn't one that is clearly applicable. But one example to a challenge to an executive order was many years ago when Governor Brewer issued her executive order denying driver's licenses to DACA recipients. And that executive order, the ACLU and other organizations challenged it in court on constitutional grounds, that it violated equal protection and that it violated preemption in the US Constitution. So it really depends on the content of the executive order, different kind of challenges that might arise. But I just offer that as one example that we've seen in our work at the ACLU. So we'll turn to the framework for the executive order that Governor Hobbs recently issued. And we can move to the next slide now. So Governor Hobbs issued an executive order, and the three key pieces of this particular executive order are around prosecuting, investigation, and extradition authority. And so the order really deals with the criminal prosecution of people who are involved in abortion access. And so the first piece of this executive order gives prosecuting authority over abortion-related cases to the Attorney General, to Attorney General Chris Mays's office, and shifts it away from county attorney prosecutions. So this is important for a lot of reasons, and this was quite a bold step that the governor took. First, providers and patients should not be prosecuted or criminalized for abortion. And this executive order really narrows how those prosecutions might happen. And the governor's order is important, particularly over the past year, where we've seen an extraordinary uncertainty in the legal landscape. And the governor's action works to centralize and create uniformity in how these kinds of cases would be managed. I will say, right, and Dr. Taylor made the very important point in her comments, that many of these kinds of actions, including litigation, are stopgap measures and they have their own limitations. And so there are some open questions and gaps in this executive order. First, it leaves open the possibility of a county charging or investigating a person, although I'm not aware that there are any cases currently, but there are various steps in a criminal case. And so while this action transfers that authority to prosecute with the AG's office, there is still opportunity at the county level to potentially charge or investigate people for abortion-related issues. The second point that I would note in terms of like a limitation is that any dismissal of a criminal prosecution is subject to the approval of a judge. Right? So if hypothetically the Attorney General tries to dismiss a case against a person for an abortion-related matter, it is up to the judge. The final decision about whether to dismiss it or not would ultimately be with the judge. So, right, lots of good stuff, but also weighted against some of these limitations. The second piece of this revolves around investigations. So the executive action bans state agencies from assisting other states in investigations into Arizonans for accessing abortion that would otherwise be legal in Arizona. And so the important piece here is that the action limits what the state agencies can do and information that they can provide around abortion related cases. But again, there are some limitations here. And one of those is that it is restricted to state agencies. And of course, that is because the governor is restricted in how far she can take an executive order. And that those state agencies, of course, have a specific definition under state law. Secondly, so related, right, is that it leaves open the possibility of a county or a local agency to assist in an investigation. And then, as with many of these kinds of orders and laws, there are limitations, right? So if there is a court order that is requiring the state to turn over information or investigation, then that may present a different situation for the governor's office or for the state in how they manage this particular section of the executive order. This particular section of the executive order also does allow state agencies to assist a person who may be the subject of an investigation. And so that may be, for example, a patient or a physician or another person who is involved in an abortion case or matter. The state will assist that person. It's not very clear what that practically means, but it is an important piece for people who might be in that situation. The third piece is around the extradition of Arizonans to other states for legal actions relating to abortion. And so here it's important, just for background, that the governor has the authority to extradite or essentially transfer or move a person who has been convicted or accused of a crime. And this authority comes from existing state law. The executive order says that the state, so Governor Hobbs, the state, can decline an extradition request made by other states for abortion-related prosecutions. But here, the state could protect people in Arizona from extradition so long as the charged conduct occurred in Arizona. But if the charged conduct occurred in another state, there may be a situation where the governor would still be required to extradite. So it offers protection, but as with many things, it really will be dependent on the individual case and sort of what the limits are around that extradition authority that the governor has. But it is an important protection in that we've been seeing across the country efforts to criminalize travel that people may take to obtain an abortion or those types of proposals. So an incredibly important piece of the executive action here. And of course, the executive order recognizes these limitations with language like to the extent permissible under Arizona and federal law. And so again, just recognizing the framework of this executive order, the content of these executive orders, and then the limitations, I think is very important to just have that understanding so that as a community, we know where we can go, what are some of the limits, and frankly, how to press for more substantive, impactful changes. And as not governor yet, Dr. Taylor, as Dr. Taylor said, right, all of this that we've seen over the last 8 months since the new administration took office is incredibly important for laying foundation, hopefully, for further changes. So the next slide will go over what's called the standing order on contraception. And so this also requires a bit of background. And what's important is that, so in this July, the Arizona Department of Health Services under the Hobbs administration issued a quote standing order allowing people 18 and older to obtain contraception over the counter without the need for a prescription. And the background here is that during the 2021 legislative session, Senate Bill 1082 was passed into law and signed by then Governor Doug Ducey. Then this year, the Board of Pharmacy proposed rules that were approved by the governor's office. And those rules and the standing order are really a guide. They're a part of the implementation process for the law that was passed in 2021. And of course, this is also a big deal. The law and the order together expand access to contraception. And as many of us know, that is incredibly important, particularly for rural communities or for those who don't have regular access to a physician in order to obtain a prescription. And then as noted here, right, we are looking at about 29 states that have implemented similar statutes around contraception. And of course, in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision and attacks on contraception, these legal protections are incredibly important and again, hopefully give elected officials in our communities something to build off of moving forward. So my next slide is really just for information, more information about our litigation at the ACLU of Arizona that we're involved in, or any of like the lobbying or policy work that we do around abortion access. We have on our website, we have a timeline and some resources that folks can plug into. And then my contact information is also on the slides, and I can drop it in the chat as well if folks have questions and want to reach out to me in that way. So I will turn it back over to Dr. Taylor, I believe, and thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Victoria. And so we just want to leave up this slide that Victoria referred to in terms of how to learn more information about the work of ACLU. And then there's another slide that has Victoria's contact information next. Great. And so we are going to transition into our Q&A section.
Yes. So we have some questions in the Q&A. We have a question that asks from Nico, what is the difference between an executive order and a standing order?
It's a great question. And I will tell you, Nico and others, I had to do some homework to figure out that very question. The standing order, right, is something that is like within that, the realm of the Department of Health Service. So it is, you can read it on their website. There is a document that is the standing order allowing people to access contraception over the counter. So it's not an order that directly comes from the governor, as does the executive order. There is authority right there. The executive order derives from the authority that the governor has to implement policy in the state. And that is derived from her constitutional authority under the Arizona Constitution. So the sort of the sources of legal authority are different for an executive order than a standing order. And the standing order is really, it seems like it is more an administrative or agency type specific that happened in this case. But I'm still doing some homework. So if others want to jump in, please.
Well, I initially was confused, but when you started to explain, and I was like, oh, so as physicians, we have standing orders. So like we put in orders like, in this situation, you can do X, Y, Z, don't even call me. Because I've given you this standing order to do that. So when you started explaining it, I was like, oh, okay, I get that. So, you know, in order for nurses to be able to carry out orders and not have to hold you up waiting for the doctor, there, you know, when you go to the hospital, for example, there can be a whole slate of orders so that when you ring that button, the nurse can just come give you that pain medicine. Like they don't have to call the doctor every time to sign. So that's what the standing order is. And so, but initially I'm like, what the heck is this? So thank you so much for.
No, but that's super helpful, Dr. Taylor. That perspective is super helpful because I had the same sort of quizzical, like, wait a minute, what does this mean?
So thank you, Nico, for that question, because initially the dots weren't connecting for me either.
Another question that was asked before the webinar was, so what really do these orders do? How can they be actually protective, being that there are so many intricacies with how it can be, implemented, the law?
So it's a case of, the devil is in the details. And there are different kinds of, I think overall, I will say, like, we have not had these types of actions or orders from the governor in the state of Arizona. So it really is an important moment for us to recognize, as Dr. Taylor said in her intro comments, to recognize this is a unique moment and a unique opportunity in terms of really creating some protection, not just protection, but hopefully some proactive advancing of how we think about abortion in the state and how people can access and how people can take those steps that they need in their lives, right? So I want to say that and reiterate that point because it is important that we have these orders. And I don't want to be like the Debbie Downer lawyer, right? But like, I just always sort of frame it in like the limitations of these things. But I think it sends both an important message, one, about where the state and where this governor and the attorney general are on abortion access. And, it has the order does have some teeth, right? It does require things of other government agencies or prohibit things from other government agencies that would otherwise not be in place, right? So directing state agencies not to utilize resources to investigate or share information about people who are obtaining abortions or providing abortions, right? That is a big step, right? And again, like maybe that'll be fought out in an individual case or however that sort of materializes, but it really does put sort of a really important point on where the state is and how the state is going to move on cases involving abortion. I don't know, Dr. Taylor, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, no, that was good because it's kind of, I'm thinking about what happens on like a federal level, right? So unless Congress then puts forth some legislation to codify the executive order, then they get reversed with the next administration. And so I just saw a question come up about the November 2024 election. It's like, again, we've had some unprecedented moves made by our governor, but ultimately laws have to follow. Because if laws don't follow, there's no guarantee that the executive order would still stand with the new administration.
That's right. Laws and leaders, right? Like the leaders that we have in these positions, right, need to change to reflect what we want to see in our state.
Thank you. Thank you. And I have one more follow-up question then. And then if anyone else has any questions, we still have a few more minutes. Don't be shy. Definitely share them in the chat or in the Q&A. So what do you think, what would be both of your recommendations for the layperson, for the, regular family person working, doing their best to take care of their, health care, but as we all know, probably struggling to truly take care of their health care and have full access to it. What can they use how can they use these executive orders as tools or as ways to either access more or understand more? How are these useful to the layperson who may not understand those intricacies?
I can start. I don't think that executive orders are useful to lay people. But I think that those of us who advocate on behalf of lay people, having an understanding of this and being able to translate it in a way, those of us who, for myself, I have a clinic and I provide care. So knowing that, if someone comes to Arizona from another state, then I could share with them that, when they go back home, if somebody tries to start a case against them, that on the Arizona side, they're protected. Like nobody is going to help facilitate, information gathering about them.
You have a roadmap, right? I think that's right. Like that's where these executive orders come in. There is a roadmap to have that kind of a discussion and ask the question where it's like, okay, wait, like there could be some protections here. It's not just, that I must or have to do this. Like, let's look at it and let's like really assess, like, given where we are with this order. And then of course, given where we are with like the law, like what can be done to make sure that the patient is being protected. Order, right, is talking about what the state can or can't do, right? So at the individual level, on the provider or patient level, I think there's more sort of discussion and definitely, I mean, even in the state level, like more discussion and more nuance that needs to happen, right? Because these orders are talking about what the state can or can't do. I would also say, right, on the question of, I mean, I agree, like it's a lot, it's dense, and there's a lot of legal, jargon in these orders. But I do think it gives folks in the community to the opportunity to ask, right? Ask their elected county attorneys, ask the governor or the attorney, right? Like where there are opportunities, I think it is important to ask the questions of our elected officials, like how do you see this order? How are you going to implement this order? How will this affect people in my county? So I do think that there's that piece, right, that gives folks a space to ask more.
We have two more questions that came up. The first that came up is for both, I believe. Is ACLU and Desert Star involved in the ballot initiative protecting abortion access in the state constitution to hopefully vote on next November? And do you think that is something to support / sign?
So thank you for the question. I'll say, right, like the ACLU of Arizona has been involved in that ballot measure, sort of speaking to some groups here locally about what that language could look like. What are sort of the legal limitations? What are some of the polling sort of pieces that we need to think about in terms of the Arizona electorate? So we've been supporting, we are supportive of that measure. And I do think that, there are ways for folks to plug in, but currently that the language, the policy language is with the Secretary of State's office for at least the next 30 days before folks can really engage in terms of signature gathering and that kind of support. But if folks have other questions about that, like you should feel free to reach out to me as well, and I can, direct you to the campaign where they're signing people up to participate there. The other thing I would say, right, is again, the back to Dr. Taylor's point, right? One, elections matter. And two, some of these legal pieces, right, like a ballot measure, like litigation, like executive orders, have limitations that we have to recognize and we have to grapple with, while we also do the really hard work of education and shifting the culture around abortion access. And so, those are things that are they're really hard to grapple with, but we have a wonderful community of people who work on these issues. So thank you for the question.
We have one other question here. We have, regarding the standing order that allows pharmacists to disperse birth control over the counter, does that only apply to emergency contraceptives like Plan B, or are other types of birth control included?
If this standing order for the governor, then ideally a pharmacist should be able to dispense any type of birth control. Now, the thing is, this is technically not over the counter. So basically the pharmacist, so there's an understanding that pharmacists have a skill set to be able to determine safety of dispensing a medication to a patient. And if you think about it, when you go pick up your medications from the pharmacy, there is an opportunity for you to speak to the pharmacist to understand your medications better. So they are healthcare professionals who can work in this manner. Now, the other piece, though, is that the FDA did approve a pill over the counter called the O pill in July of this year. Now, that medication is progestin only, and a quick primer is that the majority of oral birth control pills are a combination of two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And much of the risk conferred with taking hormonal contraceptives is attributed to the estrogen in birth control. So this over-the-counter pill, O pill, is a progestin only. And so that is likely what contributed to this particular pill that was already FDA approved back in like 1973 to become a pill that could then be prescribed over the counter. So there's not an issue, there's not much concern about safety, but that really proving that the average person could go pick that pill up, that pill box off of, their Walgreens, I'm forgetting the word, shelf, and be able to follow the instructions, like following instructions for Tylenol, for example. So that was the real hang up around it. And then plus the political nature of the idea of having people be able to access contraception by just going and picking it up off the shelf. So that's the piece of it. So the OTC part, there's still going to be some time that passes before that pill actually shows up, on the shelf of your pharmacy. And usually when medications first hit the pharmacy shelf, they are expensive. So it may not be affordable for some people who will continue to, get their birth control through prescriptions. But again, because Arizona passed that law and the governor has now provided the standing order for it, then ideally pharmacies should start being able to do this, I guess, after a few regulatory hoops to jump through, probably.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying that. And I just also want to say Plan B is not the same as what this O-pill is, right? It's because I know the question mentioned Plan B, so I want to.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that. It is not. So Plan B, so you have birth control pills that are just progestin, and it's taken every single day around the same time to prevent pregnancy. And so as long as it's taken every single day around the same time, it's going to be a certain percentage effective. Now with Plan B, that also is progestin only, but the way that works is you take it as a last ditch effort to try to avoid pregnancy after you've had unprotected sex. So it's emergency contraception. So you should not try to use that for your regular birth control. It is not as effective as an FDA approved contraceptive pill. The effectiveness is about 80%. Well, there is a weight issue with it too. So if you're like the perfect size and weight and you take it as soon as possible after you've had sex, then it's about 88% effective. But the average person is probably about 80%. So that's the difference. So emergency contraceptive is emergency. Like if you keep taking it every time you have unprotected sex, you're going to get caught pregnant. So I just want to say that so people understand that. But that's the difference.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think that's it for our questions. I want to thank you so much, both Victoria Lopez, for your work around this at ACLU of Arizona. We thank you for your leadership in finding out the litigation and legal logistics of what all this means and helping us understand it better. We really appreciate you, and Dr. DeShawn Taylor, of course, for your leadership, the work you do at your clinic, and also helping us frame the work around abortion access and reproductive care and justice in Arizona. Thank you so much for your information today. Thank you all for the attendees for coming. And as soon as we end this, we'll see a little survey that will pop up for you just to see if this worked. Did you learn something today? And is this going to work for next time for us? So I appreciate you taking those surveys. I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and email us if you have any questions. Any last words to leave, Dr. Taylor, Victoria?
This is the type of information we want to make sure we have available to you all at Desert Star Institute for Family Planning. There's so much work that's happening. So many things going on in the background, and the only time you really hear from us when we're like, okay, go vote. So we're really trying to be intentional about when things are happening, and as things are happening, creating content so that you all can understand and share, and you pass the information on. One person to 2 to 4 to 6. And then when it's time to actually show up at the polls, when we're like, show up at the polls, and you actually know what's going on and you have a better understanding, or you have the information ahead of time, you can ask the questions that need to be asked. Like this is a moment in time right now where we have an opportunity to really make a difference in the lives of Arizonans. And we're seeing wins across the country. And so the way that we win is people need to be informed. And when people are informed, then they can act.